Pennsylvania was holding its Republican primary, I came in heavy for Dave McCormick, veteran of the 82nd Airport, West Point grad, former CEO of the huge company that I can't. Not Bridgewater. I can't remember what your company was named, David. I'll look it up here in a second. Welcome back. Good to have you, Dave McCormick. Great to have you on the Hugh Hewitt Show, and congratulations on Superpower in Peril, your new book.
Hey, Hugh, thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
You know, I spent all day on airplanes yesterday reading Superpower in Peril and checking the wireless on SBV. And since
You, you
you're a banker, you must know this stuff. How did you react to Silicon Valley Bank's demise and what the government did to save it? Because you're not only an investment banker, but you're also the former Undersecretary of Commerce, you know, Treasury, you know this stuff. What did you make of what the Fed did and the FDIC?
well, I'm not a banker. I mean, it's like saying I was a lawyer, Hugh, but I do know a little bit about it. And I talked to some folks yesterday. I think the starting point for this, and it's important, is what's happened with Silicon Valley Bank is a byproduct of a much broader set of things. 10 years of flawed fiscal policy and monetary policy, with it becoming dramatically more flawed in the last 2 years under Joe Biden. And the inflation rise at a time where you had zero interest rates forced the Fed to raise rates dramatically. And that's essentially put banks who were in a position to hold treasuries for long duration in this bind. That's point one. This is a byproduct, a direct line from Biden's policies. Second point is that Silicon Valley Bank handled this terribly. Of all banks, the level of incompetence with which they handled it, the concentration of their depositors, is a disaster. And the regulators missed the boat. The San Francisco Fed missed the boat. Third, in terms of
Oh, interesting. The
yeah,
San
I mean,
Francisco Fed specifically?
yeah, because they're the oversight for the Silicon Valley Bank. And so if you look at their circumstances, this is not a complicated thing. They essentially have a huge deposit base of firms that are all in one industry, that are under a huge duress, and that all talk to one another. And they're all deposited at Silicon Valley Bank, with 90% of the deposits uninsured. At the same time, Silicon Valley Bank has, to try to capture yield, has put its balance sheet into long duration bonds. When the interest rates go up, those bonds are underwater. They have to sell assets. There's panic, and when the panic happens, people try to pull out their deposits, and that was a very obvious thing if you were a regulator who was kicking the tires and doing what they should do. So I think there's definitely some reflection to be done by our regulators, just to see what the heck happened. And then you talk about
Now,
what to do. Go ahead.
yes.
Sorry.
I was going to, what do we do about this? Because I think we just guaranteed every deposit in every bank in America. I just don't think you can do this for the blue bubble people in the Silicon Valley and tell Western Pennsylvania people pound sand when their banks get into trouble.
Yeah, listen, I'm worried about it. I'm worried about it. Listen, when you're in the middle of a crisis, you don't want to throw beer cans from the stands. But here's the way I see it. I mean, I think it's completely appropriate. Management team gets wiped out, of Silicon Valley Bank. The creditors are going to lose money. The equity holders are wiped out. But when you guarantee the depositors, I worry you've set a precedent. And so what's happening here is, a lot of people get laid off, didn't get their bonuses. The guy who had, $500,000 for window replacement is not going to get paid, And the people that had deposits, uninsured deposits, are going to get 100% payment. And so the reason they did that, presumably, is because they didn't want to suggest panic. And they did some other things, which I'll talk about in a minute. Didn't want to sort of plant seeds that, hey, the money in the bank is not good. And the reason that's so important is banking is all about confidence, because there's never enough money in the bank, right? If everybody goes to get their money, there's not enough money there. It's fractionally it's a fraction of what's required. So you have to keep confidence in the bank. And so, good for the Fed and FDIC for trying to do that. But the problem is you set a precedent. That is it's a moral hazard, no doubt about it. These were sophisticated investors that were uninsured, moral hazard, and that moral hazard creates an expectation of the future. The second thing they did, which I'm more sympathetic to, and I'll come back to this, Hugh, if you want to ask more questions. The second thing they did, they created a liquidity for banks on all their deposits at 100% of par. So essentially what they
Yes.
did is that is a way, in my opinion, to give confidence that we're not going to have runs on the banks elsewhere. That's a little bit of a bailout too, to be honest with you. But that at least strikes me as a more systemic way to bring confidence. The Silicon Valley Bank is concerning for the moral hazard reasons.
Dave McCormick, as I read Superpower in Peril, I was very fascinated by the Bridgewater backstory on ESG, DEI, your tenure there, Ray Dalio, China. But I noted that you were making the rounds with Hank Paulson when 2008 collapse occurred. And I sat in the Oval with W and 5 other talk show hosts on the last Wednesday of his presidency. He was explaining to us the Sunday afternoons of 2008 were always spent doing something crazy that he swore he'd never do in his life. But they had to do it because 2008, we were at the brink of the collapse of the financial system. Are we back on that cliff this week, or we're not close to that cliff? What's Dave McCormick think?
I've learned to not be too confident is the honest answer about these sorts of things. I think the response, particularly on the liquidity and that's available across the bank system, should go a long way in terms of giving some confidence. I think that we'll probably see some other banks that go through the washer here. But so I think if I had to guess, I think we probably averted any near-term disaster. The bigger problem is where I started, which is you've got this low interest rate environment for a long, long time, and people making a bunch of investment decisions based on that. And now you have a rapid rise in inflation, which is leading to a rapid rise in interest rates, which is creating a mismatch. And that mismatch in our banking system, that mismatch across our economy, that's not gone away. And that's the direct result of the inflation that's been absolutely accelerated by the spending policies of Biden. And so until you get that fiscal house in order, until you get on more stable ground from a monetary perspective, I think we're in for a rough ride. And I think this is just one symptom. So I'd say we probably should, not worry about waking up like we did in 2008 with the market down by 15% before the markets open. At least not now, but I think we're in for some rough days.
Yeah, Dave McCormick, as I read Superpower in Peril, I had a lot of flashbacks to 2008 because, and you emphasize Bridgewater believes in transparency. Your book is very transparent about the issues that will drive Pennsylvania voters if you choose to run for Senate again. Here, I don't think the Biden administration is being particularly transparent. Yesterday, Joe Biden leaked, we're not going to bail you out to Axios in the morning. And by the afternoon, Janet Yellen is bailing out Silicon Valley Bank in the afternoon and Signal Bank. So the lack of transparency is always unsettling. Do you have a criticism or a comment on Team Biden's approach of communicating what their plan is and why they're acting this way?
I think the word bailout is politically such a toxic concept, and rightfully so. And I think what they're trying to do is put a wrapper on this that makes it seem like it's not that. But I think the fact remains that that this is not a small thing; it's an indication of a much bigger thing. And so when I hear President Biden talk about the efforts, for example, for working people, and I look at the policies that are leading to inflation, which first and foremost hits people, living on the edge from a working class Americans, but also people on a fixed income. So I don't think, as a general rule, the policies have been in line with the rhetoric, and the goals of the policies. However, give them the benefit of the doubt. Certainly, the actual outcomes of the policies are not leading to the kinds of pursuit of the American dream that I think we need to do, as I lay out in the book and the way I described, but also in the way that President Biden talks about. So I do think there's a mismatch. This is just another example of that.
Last question on this, Dave McCormick. One of my comments yesterday flying cross country was billions for the Blue Bubble Boys in Silicon Valley, and you don't get the time of day if you're in Eastern Ohio or Western Pennsylvania on the derailment. Some people thought that wasn't fair, but I believe it's, all of a sudden these connected VCs are on the phones to their buddies in D.C. They get action in 48 hours. We still haven't got the president in East Palestine, and you know that area very well. I mean, you grew up there. You probably are closer to East Palestine than I am. It was 40 miles down the road from Warren, but it's probably less from where you grew up.
Yeah. Well, from where I was born, certainly. Yeah, I grew up in a different part of the state, but I grew up around Scranton, but I was born right near there, and I've been talking to my friends in Beaver County, who are most affected by it, and I agree with you 100% in the following sense: the thing that I discovered on the campaign trail, the thing that that I felt more viscerally, I should say, on the campaign trail, the thing that I think President Trump tapped into in 2016, is that there's this disconnect where the people that are making policy in Washington, in the Excella bubble between Washington and New York, are completely disconnected and really not particularly focused on or care about the people that are living in mainstream America. And that's certainly the case with, and the East Palestine thing is such a good example, not because the president showing up would have changed the outcome necessarily or even changed the policies. It would have been reflective of actually caring and being connected to the people that are most affected by it. And it's the same with fentanyl. It's the same with fracking. It's the same with inflation. It's the same with the open border. These are issues which are being felt by a huge part of America. And that was really the inspiration for the book, believing that that populist uprising that we're feeling has merit. It's based on the fact that the system isn't working for a huge chunk of Americans. And so what I tried to do in the book, and we can talk about that, is I try to bring together that populist impulse, which I think is reflective of a true gap in our system and policies, and traditional conservative principles that are tried and true and are key to the future of America. And I try to bring that together in an agenda about educating our people and confronting China and securing the country. And that's what I'm trying to do. And East Palestine is just an example of the things I heard on the campaign trail every single day.
You know, Dave McCormick, I've got to teach you the Luntz rule, though. Frank Luntz has an iron rule that if you're selling a book, you've got to say the title of the book, Superpower in Peril, at least 7 times in every interview. And you haven't said Superpower in Peril once yet. So if people want to get Superpower in...
Okay, listen, well, you've been saying it, so thank you for that. But it is the whole purpose of Superpower in Peril. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let's go to some of the most interesting stuff first, and then I'm going to walk through. I have 6 pages of notes, Dave. So unlike many of your interviewers, I've actually read Superpower in Peril, and it's very good. I learned a lot that I did not know. I didn't know that your wife, Dina, was a Copt from Egypt. I didn't know that she was an immigrant to the United States to become the Deputy National Security Advisor. And that story of her father meeting W coming off the plane, that's worth the book. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, I'll tell it. So her dad was an Egyptian military officer under President Sadat, and he had 3 girls. He moved when Dina was 5 because he was worried that his children wouldn't really have a chance to grow up to be able to practice their religion and be free because of the sort of rise of the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt. He moved to Texas, and he started by mowing lawns and driving a bus, and eventually became a very successful entrepreneur. But it was the American dream in practice. So when Dina wanted to figure out her path, she had to be a doctor, lawyer, and engineer. And sadly, she chose to go into politics, and she went and worked in Washington and worked for Dick Armey, and eventually got to work in the White House. And she was in the presidential personnel, and President Bush knew her because she helped build out the cabinet. But she went on to become a much more senior person. But she was a junior person, really. And President Bush came off the helicopter, Marine One, right next to the White House, and Dina had arranged for her father and a stepmother to have tickets where they could be on the rope. And President Bush came out of the helicopter, and he saw Mr. Habib and his wife on the rope, and Dina next to him. So he walked right over to him and said, "You must be Mr. Habib." And he was stunned. Dina's father was absolutely stunned, and he said, but the President Bush said, "This is just indicative of his class. Your daughter is a very important advisor to me. Very important." Shook his hand, walked away. Tears streaming down his face. He could not believe that he could bring his daughter from Egypt and that his daughter would become an advisor to the President of the United States. Just couldn't believe it.
At the end of every book, there's some things that stick, and I'm not going to forget. I've never met Dina. I've never met you in person, but I'm never going to forget that. By the way, I love W. It's not popular with some of my audience to say that, but he had the best heart of anyone who's been in the White House in my lifetime. Just his father had a great heart too, but W had a real heart for the people who worked for him and the people that he served. And he was all about protecting America. I'm glad you served there. I have one regret having read the brand new book that Dave McCormick has out there, Superpower in Peril, is that President Trump offered you the deputy secretaryship of the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is the black hole of the Trump administration. Nothing got done. The 355 ship Navy didn't get built. The Columbia class did not stay on schedule. The shipyards did not get rebuilt. Do you regret declining President Trump's offer you to be number 2 at DOD, because you would have then been number 1 at DOD when Jim Mattis left? You could have turned this around. Do you regret that decision?
I don't, because at that point I was really deep at Bridgewater. We were in the middle of really taking the company in a new direction, helping Ray, the founder, transition, and I felt obligated to try to bring that chapter to a close for him and for Bridgewater and the people that we were working with. And but I had always hoped that I might find a way to serve again. And so when I passed on that, I had a little bit of a heart tug, because I thought that might be my last opportunity to serve. And so when the Senate seat came open, and I saw an opportunity to serve, and some of the good work at Bridgewater had been done, that was what motivated me to jump into the Senate race, as I describe in the book, Hugh, Superpower in Peril. And the thing that was grabbing me at the time is the same thing that grabs me now, which is that 80% of Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction, and I certainly feel that way. And the catalyst for jumping into the race was Afghanistan, which was such a humiliation and a debacle. And as an American, trying to explain to my kids what was going on when the airplanes were taking off and people were dropping off out of the wheel wells, and we're leaving our military equipment to the Chinese in Bagram Airport. It just, to me, was the last straw, and that was ultimately what got me in the race.
Well, I'm glad to see you in the field. I have a very practical question. I prayed for John Fetterman. I want the guy to get better. I didn't want him to win, but I don't want him to be sick. He's hospitalized. I don't know how long he can do this for. If he retires and Josh Shapiro, who's a friend of mine and the new governor of Pennsylvania, he's probably a friend of yours, Josh Shapiro appoints someone, will you run against the appointee, or will you run against Bob Casey?
I'm with you on Senator Fetterman. But your heart goes out to him and his family. And I thought that Senator Fetterman and Senator Casey, for that matter, were both not right for Pennsylvania, because I think the progressive left has pulled the party to the left, and I think the policies that are in place are really contributing to the decline of America, as I described in the book. And so, I was motivated to run because Pennsylvania hasn't not had a Republican senator for 76 years. This is the first time in 76 years we've had 2 Democrats in the Senate. And so I'm not sure. There's a short answer as things play out. Whether I'm going to run. I haven't made that decision yet. And if I'm going to run, I would want to run believing that I could make a big difference. And the book is about the future of the country. And the question in my mind is, do Republicans want to win? Because if Republicans want to win, in my opinion, they have to pick candidates that can win primaries and general elections. And I try to lay out in the book here that I think even if you look all across Republicans, we agree on 80%. Conservatives, 80% of the agenda, and I try to lay out that agenda in the book. 20% we disagree on, but sadly, that 20% we disagree on has made us unable at this point to put forward candidates who can win primaries and generals. The second thing we need, though, is an agenda looking forward. I don't believe we can win looking backwards. I don't think we can win based on a strategy of grievance. I think we have to look forward based on how we're going to fix the problems like inflation and fentanyl and China's rise, and how we confront China and build back our defense and enable our children with great education. So that's what I think we need. And my question to myself is, how can I best contribute to our future in along those lines?
Dave McCormick, you came in a few hundred votes behind Dr. Oz. If you had written Superpower in Peril 2 years ago, I believe you would have won that election, because there's a lot about Dave McCormick in this book that people just don't know. And you're also getting ahead of the ESG DEI issue and Bridgewater and Ray Dalio in this book. We're going to come back to that. Was that part of the motivation in that you just want to give potential voters in Pennsylvania a longer version of what they need to know rather than a stump speech?
Well, I started writing the book long before I decided to run for Senate. And I had sold the book. It was based on a couple articles I had written that had gotten some good feedback. And so it was about 60, 70% complete before I even entered the campaign. And then what happened was I put it on hold. I went through the campaign, and of course, there's just thousands of stories that reinforce what you're seeing or make you emphasize things. So the book took a slightly different shape because it became more personal, and those stories became more pressing in terms of telling the story. But that's how it came about, and I do like the fact that when you're on the campaign trail, the two things that were hard for me, and it's even hard in this interview, which you're probably feeling, is that it's hard to talk about complex things in 30 seconds. And so when you write a book, you get to actually lay things out and make the case. The second thing that was hard for me on the campaign trail is you got to talk about yourself and say, hey, this is how great I am. This is why I can be great for Pennsylvania. And that wasn't a natural thing for me. And so in the book, Superpower and Peril, I try to tell my story, but only as it relates to the particular recommendations and the policies. And I try to tell it in a way that's, human. So I talk about all the things I've screwed up, and I talk about getting fired, and I talk about a bunch of other things, and you don't get to do that on the campaign trail either. So I'm honestly not sure if this. I hope you're right. I'm honestly not sure if this book is good politically or not politically, but I'm really sure that it's authentically me, and I feel great about that.
Oh, I think you can say asked and answered to a lot of questions now. And at every stop, if you run, you're going to have copies of Superpower and Peril with you. And you can say, if you want to learn more about the Chinese Communist Party and the threats that it poses across the board, it's detailed over here in Superpower and Peril. I learned, however, if you're a paratrooper and you're the first person out of the plane, one, don't invite your parents to watch, and two, make sure the next guy doesn't jump on top of you. We almost added another memorial at Gettysburg that day. Tell that story.
Yeah, that was something. So my parents, we had a battalion in the 82nd, and the colonel would take us to battlefields, and we walked the battlefield. 25 officers in the battalion to learn the lessons of leadership and warfighting. So we would go to different battlefields across the country, and of course, because we were paratroopers, we'd get an airplane and we'd arrange to parachute into that area wherever it was. We'd spend a day or two there, and then we'd parachute back. We'd fly back to Fort Bragg and parachute back. So it came that we were going to do Gettysburg, which I had done a couple times at West Point, and walking the battlefield of Gettysburg is incredible. And so my folks live in Harrisburg. So I called him up and said, I'm coming. We're going to do this. We have arranged this farmer's field. And he, and so I had them to be there on time to watch us jump in. But it's hard to tell who's who. So I arranged to be the first person out of the airplane so my parents would know. And sure enough, we went over the farmer's field. The jump master, who's the person that gives you the okay, I jumped out of the airplane, and I saw this beautiful farmer's field behind me. And then I heard a little sound. I looked up, and there was feet running across my canopy. The guy that came out after me was on top of me, and my parachute collapsed. And so for a minute, or not a minute, but a few seconds, my parachute was had folded. I was starting to fall, and then he ran off the side, and my parachute redeployed. And I landed safely, and I rolled up my parachute and ran over to my mom and dad, and they were in absolute tears and never came to anything again. And
Dave McCormick, I have got a son, a son-in-law, and a nephew on active duty, and I don't want to know what they're doing until it's over. Like, my son was at Al Assad when the Iranians decided to, blanket it with ICBMs, got out 10 minutes beforehand on a helicopter. I said, don't tell me about this stuff. I'm very proud of your service, but I don't want to know where you are. And I don't want to watch you jump out of an airplane did they know what was happening? Did they see it?
Oh, they saw the whole thing. No, it was tough on parents. They saw the whole thing. But the reason I tell the story in the book is, so Adams County is right there at Gettysburg. And I was at an event at Adams County. And it was a number of people who were pretty hostile to me.
Very pro-Trump. Trump had come out against you, and the former president had labeled you as a globalist, etc.
Right. Trump had come out against me and it attacked me and so forth. So this group was somewhat hostile to me. And so we're sitting there at breakfast, and I'm eventually going to get to talk. So I stand up and talk, and I tell that story because I'm right there in Gettysburg. We drove through Gettysburg to get to the breakfast, and it warmed up the whole group. And it just reinforces a point. we have so much in common. And the thing that we care about, which is the future of America and patriotism and commitment to our men and women in uniform, that there's a lot of common bonds. And as much as we fight among ourselves and fight across our country as Americans, man, we got to continue to come back to what we agree on. And that was one of the things we agree on, is that we love our men and women in service.
Dave McCormick, when I was reading Superpower in Peril and Ray Dalio's name came up. Now, I would not know Ray Dalio if I walked into him on a bus. I wouldn't know him from Adam. I know his name only because of the ESG stuff. He's the venture capitalist everybody loves to hate. He's Mr. DEI. You explain what the ESG approach was. I always say it stands for evading the scrutiny of government if you're a big enough person in the United States. But explain to people what the Bridgewater approach to ESG and DEI. They're separate issues, but you are very candid in Superpower in Peril about the threat they pose to shareholder value. And I think we have a sponsor, it's consumersresearch.org. That's all they do is track ESG driven companies. And they don't do as well as non-driven ESG companies, at least as ESG has come to be understood, which is to be blinkered vis-a-vis China, but to be down on everybody in America in the carbon fuels business.
Yeah. Well, just to be fair to Ray, that I don't think Ray's known for that at all. Ray created Bridgewater, and Bridgewater is it's a global macro investor, and so it's one of the largest in the world. Ray created this really unique culture, wildly successful. So ESG was never really his thing. He's been very strong voice on China, which he's gotten a lot of criticism for, and he and I had some disagreements on, which I try to talk about in the book, particularly how we should think about China as a threat and how America should deal with China. But to your point around ESG and D&I, there's two stories I really tell in the book. One is that my entire life, I've been so proud of the fact that I have built high-performing teams. And when I've tried to build high-performing teams, whether I was an Army officer or whether I was a CEO of a tech company in Pittsburgh or whether I was a CEO of Bridgewater, and those high-performing teams were highly diverse. Great women, great men from all sorts of backgrounds. I mean, the military has people from all over the place, and you come together in a common mission. And I was always proud of the fact that I did a great job of building those teams that were highly diverse and was recognized for it, and that I stuck so clearly to merit and merit driving decisions in hiring, firing. A high-performing team is only as effective as its weakest link, and so you have to embrace reality. And Ray was really strong in embracing reality, and you have to build great teams. And I talked about the pressure and the drumbeat to make compromises along those lines because of the pressures from everything from clients to internal employees to the broader agenda that CEOs have adopted. The ESG point, I'll hit that quickly. I agree with you 100%. What's happened is you've had investment managers, BlackRock's a good example, but there are a number of others, that have embraced ESG and tried to dictate that companies should incorporate ESG as part of the criteria on whether they'll invest in those companies. And you're seeing now the huge backlash, which I agree with, of a number of states, in particular pension plans, to say, no way, we want to invest in a way that protects us as fiduciaries. And what that means is we need to invest in a way that's not driving a social agenda, but driving an agenda for the best return for our pensioners. And that's something I agree to with 100%, and I talk about in the book.
I would have no objection to ESG if it was actually genuine. If they looked at the Uyghurs in the concentration camps, if they looked at Hong Kong losing their freedom, if they looked at any of the issues that you touch on about the Chinese Communist Party and incorporated that, ESG would actually work to decouple us from China. But that's not happening. What do you think of a country that cannot put an NBA player on TV and ask them about China because they go, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil? We are in the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party in many sectors of America.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I try to hit that in the book, Superpower in Peril. And it talks about confronting China is one of our key priorities. And, when you're a CEO, one of the things you learn, Hugh, is that there's lots of things that need to be fixed and that are broken. But zeroing in on the 3 or 4 things that are most important to America's exceptionalism, America's renewal was the thing I tried to do in the book. And then confronting China, we need a whole of nation strategy. Right now, there's this action or that action. There's not we're all in this together with a holistic view of how to take on China. And I lay out in the book 5 things that I think we should do. The first is we need to decouple our economies strategically. So microchips, pharmaceuticals, there's a whole range of industries that I'm embarrassed to admit, I didn't even know how dependent we were on the Chinese for pharmaceuticals until COVID happened. The fact that 90% of our microchips are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China is lunacy. But this is the situation we've let ourselves get in. So we have to right that immediately. Second thing we need to do, to your point, go ahead, sorry.
Well, you mentioned, let's stay on chips for a second. I was unaware that between 1990 and 2020, China built 37 fabs, and we built none. Now we've got one underway in Ohio, thank God, Ohio, not Pennsylvania, and we've got one underway in Texas, but that's not enough. Did you like the CHIPS Act, or did you not like the CHIPS Act?
I liked the goal of the CHIPS Act. I didn't like the substance of the CHIPS Act in the following sense. It was inadequate investment in R&D, and then here we just see that they've put on top of these subsidies, which are direct subsidies to companies. I lay out in the book how I would think about bringing key sectors of technology to the forefront. It's not the way they're doing it here. But the subsidies are connected to all sorts of progressive policies that have to go along with them. The Commerce Department just rolled out a whole agenda on you have to have childcare, you have to have this and that. So taking something that's of criticality to our national security, and then it's just what's happening in the military too, where the climate agenda is almost usurped the warfighting agenda. That's what's happened to the CHIPS Act. So the idea that we need to invest differently and make a huge investment in microchips, I'm 100% in agreement with. The way it was designed, I have some issues with.
Can I talk a moment about Coach Lynn? Do you mind talking about your football coach? Because everyone in the audience either has had a coach, is a coach, or knows a coach, and they know how coaches talk. And there's a lot. You're a football player. You went to West Point as a wrestler. You became captain of the wrestling team and all that good stuff. And we'll talk about that. But when you're a football player, you're kind of the leader. And Coach Lynn comes in at halftime. He is not happy with David McCormick. And I wish I had a tape of this. What do you think, Coach Lynn? Is he still with us, by the way? Is he still alive?
He died about, 20 years ago. Yeah.
All right. So what do you think Coach Lynn would think about the way politics are being done in our leadership elites today?
He'd be kicking ass and taking names. He was a great guy. I'll tell the story quickly if it's okay with you.
Please.
I was a sophomore in high school, and I was a bench warmer. I'd only get pulled into games when we were winning big or losing big. But when I got in, I'd really kill myself, and I played defense, and I had a few big tackles. And the coach got fired. We got a new coach, and so he watched films all summer. And he calls me out of the blue and says, "Coach Lynn, I'm the new coach. Come on in and see me." And he said, "Listen, I watched the films. You got real potential. I want you to be our starting linebacker, but you got to earn it. So go to camp and work your tail off." And so I did it. I worked so hard that summer. And at the end of the summer camp, he pulled me aside and said he wanted me to be the co-captain of the team as a junior. And this was inconceivable to me. Inconceivable. I would have never dreamed it in a million years. And it made me start to see myself differently than I had ever seen myself before. And so our team turned out to be pretty good. And the second year won a big championship. And but boy, the standards that he put on me, and that thing I tell in the story is about a game where we were playing. It was a huge rainstorm, and we were playing terribly in the first half. And he came in, and I had a lot of press that week leading into it, saying I was doing a good job. And he came in and went after the whole team, and then he kept saying at the end of it, he'd say, "And Dave McCormick, you've done such a good job. You're really those press clips we're reading about. You're really great." Complete sarcasm. And then at the end of that time, he just laid into me. I mean, it was so punishing. But I was the leader. And so I couldn't shirk. I didn't want to stand there and take it, and so we went out the second half and we turned things around. And what I learned from him is accountability, man. If you're a leader, you got to step up and take responsibility. You got to demonstrate. You got to lead by example. And you have to hold yourself to the highest of standards. And
it's one of the best anecdotes in Superpower in Peril, because it really does say, if you're going to be a leader, if you aspire to that, you've got to be accountable. And if you get the bark taken off of you, that's part of the job. And I just thought, there's a lot of great stories in Superpower in Peril. We're going to get to some substance here. but coach stories resonate with Americans. Have you told that story up and down Pennsylvania, by the way?
I've told it a few times. Probably need to tell more. You know, the happy end of the story. It's not he's passed, but when I was in the Gulf War, I had the presence of mind to write a letter, which was almost 10 years later, and tell him just how much he meant to me. And we did stay in close touch, but just tell him he made the difference. I became an all-state linebacker. I went to West Point. All of this was because of something he saw, and he died. And I talked to his son 4 or 5 years ago, who's now a fishing guide in Wyoming, and I go fishing every year now in Wyoming, and we'll fish for a couple of days, and we'll talk about his dad. And he said that letter was his dad's prized possession. So, these little things. Whenever somebody comes up to me and says, "Hey, can I have 20 minutes to talk about my future?" and you have a million things going on, you say, "Ah, I can't." You think to yourself, "I can't do it." I always think, "Man, I got to do it because maybe I could be Coach Lynn to somebody if I can shoot straight with them."
It's a great prism through which another thing that comes through in Superpower and Peril. I'm a big advocate. I'm a civilian. I have got no military experience, and so I try not to opine on this. But the reason I read Tom Cotton's book, Only the Strong, or Mike Pompeo's book, Never Give an Inch, or anyone like you and they who've served at a platoon level leadership, is that, as you explain, you've got a bunch of people from all over America, are privates. You got this Puerto Rican sergeant who's keeping the Green Lieutenant from blowing up his whole airborne sea company. And if you've led in the military, you've led all of America. It really is the last melting pot. And I think even without intending to do it, you communicated that message again. We need more veterans, whether it's of the first Gulf War, the second Afghanistan, the war on terror, Somalia, wherever we go, we need more veterans in Congress.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I was thinking about. I was telling this story the other day. I had this platoon. It was very, white kid from rural Alabama, black kid from Newark, Puerto Rican platoon sergeant who kicked the new lieutenant's butt. And all that time of deploying, going around the world, training around the clock, I don't ever remember talking about politics. In fact, I can't even remember I don't even know if I knew what party they were or what their views were. We were just in it together. We were in it as a team, try to serve the country, serve one another. And that bonding experience, I think, puts your responsibility in context. Walter Buckley had this great line that citizenship is a combination of the privilege of being part of the greatest country in the world and the responsibility to keep it that way. And so the military is one way to exercise that responsibility. And factually, 1950, 80% of the members of Congress were veterans, of course, after World War II. Today, it's about 19%. And I think that matters. It doesn't have to be the military, but a common bond that brings us together. Honestly, it's one of the reasons I'm so concerned about, and I talk about in the book, Superpower and Peril, the disaster of American history in our schools. Because if you're not taught America is a nation, and you don't believe that, then when it starts to not be exceptional, you don't feel the motivation to fix it and preserve it. And the military helps you do that.
Yeah, I've gotten to know Michael Waltz a little bit. My son works for him, but I got to know him because he's part of the Nixon seminar. And he's now chairman of the Readiness Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee in the House. And we are not ready. I mean, you go at length in Superpower and Peril. The Chinese Communist Party has built the largest navy in the world in 10 years. They have this massive mound of missiles. You talk about in the Gulf War, you had to blow up one base full of Iraqi weaponry. And by the way, I don't know how you do that. You didn't go into the detail. How do you blow up 18 miles or square miles of 18 acres of munitions and not get blown up? How do you do that?
We had to go down underneath and rig each bunker. And then each bunker needed to be rigged onto a chain that went throughout the facility. So when you blew it up, you blew them all up at the same time. So there was a linkage across each one of the bunkers. So it was quite an undertaking.
So we're just not. We need people who have done things like that in Congress. Now I want to go to China and make sure that in our time left, David, we talk about that because you spend a lot of time on the Chinese Communist Party. Earlier today, I had on Len Kordakovsky, who was Keith Kroc's deputy. I told him you gave Keith a lot of shout outs in Superpower and Peril, which I don't know if he knows or not, but you were very much into the clean network approach. Over the weekend, or over the last week, I was on vacation. China inked a deal with Saudi Arabia and Iran in Beijing. This sent a shudder. I know we have a banking crisis. We've got a Stanford Law School meltdown over DEI, but people should be paying attention to the fact that China just flipped the Nixon script. They brought Saudi Arabia to Beijing to become frenemies with Iran. That is geopolitics at the highest level. And once again, Biden got hold my beer, Joe Biden. He wasn't even aware of it.
Right. And you know why I think that happened is because if you're a traditional ally of the United States, if you want to be pro-American and you want to put your chips on America, under this president or Joe Biden, I think you've got real worries. And I believe that's what's happened in this case with many of our friends. Saudi Arabia has been a longstanding ally. That's not to defend some of the bad behavior, but a longstanding ally. I was stationed in Saudi Arabia for almost a year.
Yes.
In preparation for the invasion into Iraq. They're a critical ally in the world. And I know from a fact in my conversations across the world that if you've been depending on America, and you watch what happened in Afghanistan, or you watch the ham-handed movement early on with Nord Stream 2 and the invitation of Putin into Ukraine, and you look at the way we're handling China, you're worried that you don't have a steady hand in the White House who's going to project strength and preserve that alliance and defend it. And that's what's happened with Saudi Arabia, I believe. And so it's also a byproduct of a second thing, which is China. China has a strategy. China has a plan for global primacy. It's a techno-authoritarian plan to project an ideology around the world, and they're executing the plan. And as I say in the book, Superpower in Peril, they have a plan. What's our plan? And sadly, we don't have a plan. We don't have a plan to build muscle at home and engage abroad in a way that ensures America's superpower. And that's the whole purpose of the book, to lay that agenda out.
You're very complimentary of Robert Lighthizer as our trade rep for bringing trade. It actually brought China to the table. It began the pivot. You quote Mike Pompeo at the Nixon Library. I interviewed the secretary when he was our guest at the Nixon Library after his remarks. It was an important moment in American global history. We pivoted away from China. We broke the Nixon deal, and we did it because they broke it earlier. Here's the key question. You talk a lot about data, and I'm glad you did. Nobody talks about the importance of data. They've got 1.2 billion people. We have 330 million people. So they're capturing the billion people's data every day. We have no systemic approach to data. What is the recommendation there? I know you're concerned about privacy. I've written extensively about the book, The Rise of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a double-edged sword. Data drives AI. AI drives the future. Privacy drives Americans personally. How do we walk that line, Dave McCormick? You lay it out in the book, but I want you to summarize it for the audience.
Well, it's a very challenging line to walk, as you said. I think the starting point is data is incredibly valuable. It's strategic in a way that I don't think we have embraced as a country. And China has a real advantage because it not only has data, but it has complete control of the data. And that's a driver of innovation in artificial intelligence and a number of things. And it's one of the reasons. There was a report, Hugh, I'm not sure if you saw it, but the Australian think tank came out a couple weeks ago. It was written in the Wall Street Journal that of 44 critical technologies, satellites, AI, 5G, and so forth, China was in the lead in 37 of them. This is an independent Australian think tank. And data is a big reason for that because they've got that data advantage. And so we need to treat data. People talk about data as the new oil. It's more than oil because it can be used over and over again. And if you look at the success of the COVID vaccines, they were partly driven by the ability to pull data together. So data is important. That's point number one. We have no strategy for dealing with data. And so we need a strategy for drawing on data from our allies, like the 5G countries that we share intelligence with. We need a process for protecting our data too from the Chinese because TikTok and others are getting access to our data every day. But we also need a process for protecting our data from our own social media companies. Doesn't it give you a little bit of an eerie feeling when you buy a pair of sneakers online and then the next 10 times you get any inbound things that it's other vendors that have bought your data and are trying to send you sneakers? Imagine what the world has access to about you. I mean, I read an article recently where the Chinese knew what our troops were doing in Afghanistan because they were reading their Fitbit data. So
that's in the book. That's remarkable. I had no idea. And as you say, all of our data goes to Beijing, but none of Beijing's data comes out. It's a completely
Exactly.
imbalance. But decoupling. I want to close here. I want to close by talking about the elites that you discuss in the administrative state. I'm writing a piece for the Post that'll run sometime this week about the administrative state and how it is destroying fishing in the Atlantic and water conservation on the Pacific. Everywhere they go, they destroy stuff. Meanwhile, the FDIC in San Francisco or the Federal Reserve in San Francisco is not doing their job. I ran OPM for 2.5 years. You were doing exciting and interesting things. I was running OPM. Nobody cares about OPM, but we got 2.85 million civilian employees. How do we get control of this government, Dave McCormick? The administrative state is just enormous and is impacting everyone. And then when a crisis happens, as in East Palestine, close to where you grew up, nothing happens. It's
Yeah.
completely dysfunctional.
Yeah. Well, it's I talk a lot in the book, as you say, in Superpower and Peril, about institutional decay,
Yes.
and that's what I think is happening in our institutions, and it's sadly our institutions of government. It's also our schools. It's also our military to some degree. It's our business community. It's our churches. This is a systemic societal problem. And when I was in the government before, I remember coming into the Treasury and thinking from a leadership and management perspective, it was lacking in some ways, to say the least. And the guidance and the feedback I got from everybody was, we don't have time for that. We do not have time for that. What we have to get is right is the policies right. And I think that's been perpetually what's happened. And as a consequence, we've got this embedded bureaucracy that's ideologically opposed to what we as conservatives believe, and it makes the capacity to fix things very challenging. And so we've got to root it out, and we've got to have leadership in place. We've got to win elections first and foremost. The starting point is winning the House, the Senate, and the White House, and then we've got to have that be a critical agenda. And there's lots of things that President Trump did that I agree with. One of them was just simple idea of for every new regulation you take away two. I mean, it seems so simple, but it's a very clarifying approach. There's a ridiculous. I saw this in the fracking industry. The amount of regulatory overreach is beyond compare. I see it in the Army. We talked about defense. If I was Secretary of Defense, I would root out the idea that the United States Army is going to release its climate strategy before its warfighting strategy. This is the kind of madness that takes over when you have a bunch of people embedded in the bureaucracy that have an agenda that's inconsistent with conservative agenda, but in my mind, but more than that, inconsistent with what I think is best for America. And so it takes leadership, and it's going to be like in Pennsylvania football, 1 to 2 yards at a time in a cloud of dust. That's the only way to do it.
That's an Ohio thing. You can't steal from Ohio everything, Dave. I'm telling you right now. Let me close by asking you about obviously, you're considering a Senate run. You could run for president and just skip this. You got the book out. You could just run for president. You'd be up against your buddy Pompeo, another West Point grad, and about your age, et cetera. But there's plenty of room on the stage. Is that in the back of your mind at all?
No. I mean, my wife just insists that I get some job of some sort, so she'd be open to just about any job. but no. I mean, what I hope if this book was wildly successful beyond my dreams, we would have people that are running for president and ultimately who win the presidency use this as at least an input to the direction to take the country. I don't see this. I don't see people looking forward enough. I'm not directing that to any specific person. I think we need to have leadership that looks forward. And as I just said in the book, and I said the other day, I interviewed your friend. It was interviewed by your friend Selena Zito. I'm not sure if this book is a winner politically. I'm not sure if a happy warrior wins in American politics today. But that's what I am. And that's what I want to be, and we'll see if there's a place for that. I hope there is, but I'm not sure yet.
Last comment, Dave McCormick. You write a lot about Reagan. I was there. I worked for him for 6 years. I was with Nixon and San Clemente when Jimmy Carter was destroying Iran and when Carterism gripped the United States. And we got lucky. We got a Reagan. I've got a friend who tells me we need another Reagan, a member of the Senate that you may be joining. You don't get another Reagan all the time. Do you think we can turn this around, or is the Thucydides trap upon us and we just have to get used to it?
Well, the irony is if you look at the cover of my book, Superpower and Peril, it's red and blue and it's ominous and it's like, wow, it looks like it's a. And then the book's optimistic, and so I am optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is, in fact, what you lived through, and I lived through more as a kid. But I lived through the dog days of the Carter administration and the waiting in line for gas with odd days and even days and stagflation and Desert One. And, my dad had a big country school. We'd sit in line for 45 minutes to fill up the tank. And then that was in 1979. 4 years later, I was at West Point walking along those beautiful pathways, and it was Morning in America. 4 years from 80% of Americans thinking the country was going in the wrong direction. Sound familiar? To a Morning in America. So I think it's always easy to underestimate the power of leadership and vision. But I think we get the right leadership and the right vision and look forward, not backward. We're going to, it's the American tradition. We get to the edge of the cliff and we pull ourselves back. And I think we'll do that.
Well,
again.
I think Superpower in Peril is a first step towards turning a lot of happy warriors into happy warriors again and getting them out of the resignation and off of the chair and out of the couch. Dave McCormick, thanks for spending a lot of time with me. Congratulations on Superpower in Peril, going to be a bestseller. Keep coming back, and I hope you run. I really do hope you run in the Keystone State. They need somebody to help them out, even though that line about Pittsburgh in here almost stopped me pretty early on. Pretty early on, you say something about Pittsburgh, almost stopped me right there. But there it is. Pittsburgh holds a special place in my heart, page 73. Almost put the book down because you've got to be a Steelers fan, right?
Oh yeah. But you forgave me once, you'll forgive me again.
Yeah, your quarterback had little hands. We'll see what happens. Dave McCormick, thank you. Congratulations. Keep coming back.
Sure. Good day. Thank you.
Thank you.